Good morning. Thanks for joining us here. My name is Tyree McCracken. I'm a graduate student career advisor at the Career Center at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, Alberta. And as you can tell, I have three guests with me, and we're all meeting virtually from our own homes, I believe. I'm not sure, but I think we're all in our own homes right now. I know I am. But one thing we're learning a lot about right now through necessity is the idea of virtual interviews and virtual meetings. And there's a lot of information out there about virtual meetings and virtual interviews. Even before this lockdown occurred, though, I noticed more and more of my students seeking positions in faraway places were doing interviews via phone, and then increasingly via Google Meets or Zoom or other FaceTiming applications via their computer or their phone. And this has introduced a whole bunch of new questions, and suddenly experts have sprung up all over the world who claim to know the best way to do these things and give advice and give people tips on how to do virtual interviews. Because there are some different considerations, there are things we have to talk about and things we have to address, because you still want to give your best impression, and you want to avoid some of the hiccups and things that can cause some headaches and some problems while you're doing these virtual interviews. Recently, at the Career Center at University of Alberta, we completed 40 interviews for student staff positions, and these were all done via the virtual platform. We used Google Meet. Now, this platform was great. We got through all the interviews with only minor technical glitches, despite the fact that we aren't extremely tech savvy and we don't have home studios set up and things like that. But through doing those 40 interviews, we learned a lot of things. Now, there's articles all over the internet, and if you want to use your internet, you can find a whole bunch of articles giving you all kinds of advice and professional advice on what to do when you've got a virtual meeting. But what we want to do today is speak from our experience as we've met with students doing career advising and doing interviews for student positions. And there's certain things that we've learned ourselves from our own experience, and we want to share that with you today. So I'm going to allow the other three individuals who are joining me today to introduce themselves. And we'll start with Rosemary Panessa. If you want to go ahead, please.
Hi, so I'm Rosemary, and I work as a Career Peer Educator, or CPE, at the University of Alberta Career Center. So part of our role is that we do mock interviews, as well as a variety of different advising appointments, presentations and seminars on different career-related topics to help support the student and alumni body here at the university campus.
Thanks, Rosemary. Keith, do you want to introduce yourself?
So my name is Keith Heimel, and I am the coordinator of the Peer Educator program that Rosemary is part of. And so I guess what I'll be discussing is like Tyree mentioned, we did the 40 interviews because we hired 23 CPs per year. And just mention a couple of things that maybe through the interviews had maybe had some even minor negative effects on the interview.
Thanks, Keith. And Emily Marriott?
So like Tyree mentioned, my name is Emily Marriott. I work at the Career Center with the Graduate Student Internship Program as a career advisor. So I support master's and PhD students who are going into internships. And I sat in on the 40 interviews with Keith and Tyree. So we did see quite a lot of little things that kind of upset the flow of an interview. So we're really excited to be here to talk to you today.
Thanks. Emily, maybe we'll start right off with you. We did notice a difference in our interviews when people use different hardware to conduct their own interviews, whether it was phone versus computer. And I know you had a couple of points you wanted to make on this, and I know that not everybody has access to a high quality laptop. Not everybody has access to a high quality smartphone even, but so we have to keep those things in mind, but sometimes there is an option. And so what did you observe when you saw students applying for our student staff positions using either phones or laptops or desktop computers?
Yeah, I think the technology is an important thing to think about. I think it's fine to use a cell phone. It's something that you have access to. It's easy to move. And, you know, it's in my house, for example, there's a lot of art on my walls and a lot of bookshelves, and so there's not a lot of blank backgrounds that I have. So using a phone can sometimes be easier because I can move around to different spaces that are a little bit smaller and easier to maneuver a clear background in. But the one thing with phones is in one of the interviews that we sat in on, someone had a phone call happen in the middle of their interview, which paused the interview and also threw off the candidate in terms of the actual answer to the question. So I think if you are using a phone, it's really important to turn on Do Not Disturb or a similar function, or make sure that your incoming calls are silenced and you've told people, please don't call or text me. Laptops, I think, are also great. They're easy to move again. Desktops can be really good. Dual screens can be really useful because you could have your resume and your application information up on one. It's just then you have to be careful of what's going to actually happen in the video. And are the interviewers going to be able to actually see you? Are you going to be focusing your attention on one screen when the camera's on the other? So I think what it really comes down to is testing your technology a couple times and making sure that you are familiar with the platform and you're familiar with the possible technical hiccups that could happen and how you can address them.
Okay, thanks, Emily. I don't know if any of you has any knowledge about how bandwidth works. I have no idea. But let's say I was about to go and do an interview somewhere, and I want to make sure that, do I have any control over the bandwidth in my vicinity? I know people in apartments typically have a tougher time because there's so many people using the bandwidth. What about within a household? Are there things I can do to make sure that if I have a really important interview coming up, to make sure that I'm not going to be continually freezing, or is that completely beyond my control? I'll leave this one open to whoever has an idea because I have none.
More and more people are working from home, so there's more and more strain on servers. I know some of the companies have had outages. So unfortunately, I don't know if it's something you can really control 100%. Obviously, you can pay for a higher download and upload speed, but that's not necessarily going to fix all the issues. But yeah, I think you might be asking the wrong crowd since none of us are technical experts.
For sure, yeah. So when we look at using a phone versus using a computer, oftentimes, Emily, you mentioned the background, and we want to think about our background when we're doing a virtual interview for sure. That means, I know some people are using Zoom backgrounds, some people are using a background in their house, but the actual, before we move on to what's actually being seen by the other person, we have to think about the angle and placement a little bit of the camera and the phone itself, because I know that we did a lot of interviews where people, we were basically looking up their nose and all we could see was behind them was the corner of where the roof meets the wall. And it really didn't give a good impression. There was also ones where it looked like the person was in a blank interrogation cell somewhere. And it looked, it was very awkward. It's really different than what Rosemary has right now, which is a plain blank background, which looks really professional. And it doesn't look like she's in a basement of an abandoned building in downtown Edmonton. But Rosemary, do you want to talk about angle or camera placement, especially if somebody has to use, maybe even if they have to use a cell phone or whatever, and then we'll go on and talk a bit about the actual background themselves.
Yeah, so right now I'm currently using a computer, and I think making sure that it's eye level is really important, or slightly angled, maybe downwards instead of upwards, so you're able to see more of a downward angle. Another thing that I find that's really important is right now I currently have a light, a lamp right in front of my camera, and that's what's giving me this amazing lighting that you guys are all seeing. So you don't need really professional or amazing lighting. You can just take something like a lamp that you might have in your dorm and just place it in front of the camera, and it really does help that professionalism that you're seeing. I think also with a iPhone, you can also do the same thing with the lighting, just making sure that you're placing it in front of a bright light and that it is eye level. If you have to place it maybe on a stack of books as opposed to holding it so that it is still, that can also help as well.
Because we don't want to look like we're in a dingy place. I noticed we did some interviews where people sat right in front of with a bright light behind them. And so it just looked like this sort of dark outline speaking to us. And it really made a difference. Also, if people didn't have enough light, they just sort of look washed out or unhealthy or something, like it just didn't present. And let's face it, this is an interview and people can see you. So how we project ourselves and our face is important here. And so you say a good bright light sort of behind the camera facing you, right? And then, and I know some people talk about having some lights from the side, or if you have access to natural light as well, but making sure that natural light is placed correctly. That's pretty important, isn't it?
Yeah, that's really important. Like, especially like days like today where it's pretty gloomy outside, to make sure that you aren't being washed out. And it goes back to what Emily said before, making sure that you're practicing and looking at your technology before. Every time I get on a Google Meet, I'll always like make up my own call and look at myself in the camera with the lighting and the setup just to make sure that it does look professional. So making sure that you're practicing with the technology that you're using beforehand can really help you strengthen your appearance in terms of interviewing someone.
Okay. And then another thing is I mean, is there a difference in how we would dress when we're talking about a virtual interview? We have to think about, and I've had people ask this before, like, how do I dress for these interviews? Obviously, nobody's going to show up with a hooded sweatshirt and the hood up, but are there certain colors that are better or whatever? And are there certain ways of dressing to look professional that come across well? And are there certain conventions maybe that you guys have noticed on how people dress and things like that for a virtual interview as opposed to an in-person one? And believe it or not, I have had the question, somebody's asked me, they said, I know that on TV, and this is something I have no idea about, but people wear makeup. And makeup is important on TV, and they have to do it a certain way different than they would face-to-face. I've had clients say, how do I make sure that if I wear makeup, that I do it the right way, and what kind of colors should I be wearing? I know this is very sort of, seems like superficial, but these are things that people ask and they want to know, and if there's a way to maximize this with their lighting. So Emily, Keith, or Rosemarie, I'll leave that open to anybody to answer.
Yeah, I can jump on. I think with makeup, the thing I usually recommend to my clients is if you're going to an interview, wear what you're comfortable in. So for makeup specifically, if you don't usually do a full face of makeup, you're likely not going to want to do like a full face of makeup for an interview. On camera, there are sometimes recommendations to wear maybe just a bit of lipstick or a little bit of blush if you are like me and very pale, because it'll help you to not be quite so washed out on camera. But I think it does come back to what is your comfort level, because at the end of the day, you're still the one being interviewed. You're in the hot seat. So you want to make sure that you're comfortable with the way that you're presenting yourself. And in terms of clothing, my usual recommendation is that people still dress as they would if they were going to an in-person interview, but take into account that you're on camera and that you have a background that's like, for example, my wall is blue. So I have a blue turtleneck that I love that I would sometimes wear to an interview, but I'm not going to wear that to an interview that's virtual because I won't blend in with the wall and only my face will show up as different. So I think it's just taking into account, what are the factors that are different because I'm doing this over a camera, but still recognizing that it's up to my own comfort level and how I want to present myself.
For sure. And I think I like to go on if there's a meeting I think Zoom, somebody has to let you in, but with Google Meets, you can get on there and beforehand, and you can just check your surroundings as well. How does this look on the camera, and just sort of do a run through. And I know I like to do that. I think, oh my goodness, I've got that, an old banana peel stuck on the bookshelf or something I don't want there, and I can move that out of the way. Anybody have anything else to add? Or if you have something to go on and you have some particular insight on backgrounds, especially when we talk about the use of Zoom and the multiple backgrounds possible there.
Yeah, I can jump in too. So I think one of the things that I've noticed is a lot of people wearing like very bright kind of colors on camera. And I find that depending on the background and also the lighting, it can be actually very distracting as well. So if you take a look at like Tyree, for instance, he's got quite a colorful background, but he doesn't have this super bright, crisp, white shirt. It's a little bit more muted. So that makes it actually easier for me to see him and be able to actually listen to what he's saying and not distracted by the super bright color that he might be wearing. So I think that also goes well in terms of makeup as well. It is important to be comfortable with what you are wearing and what you're doing to your face and everything, but maybe save the smoky eye and the really bright eyeshadow for maybe a different day, just because we want people to be able to listen to what you have to say and not be distracted by any external factors.
Yeah, thanks for that. I know Keith and I had both talked about maybe experimenting with the smoky eye for this interview, and I'm glad we decided against it. Keith, have you got any comments about backgrounds? Have you done any Zoom interviews or any meetings, or even just the way people have their backgrounds from those 40 that we did? Things that you noticed that you found distracting, or things that were particularly effective?
Nothing particular, but I think as far as clothing, the only thing I can really add is something I think Emily said, but just making sure there's a contrast between you and the background, I think is important, because that's what they should be concentrating on as the interviewers, and have something more like Rosemary has, where it's a blank wall and the focus is directly on you and what you're saying.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. We don't want to be distracting from what we're talking about. I know with my background here, I've had people comment on certain books and say, "Oh, that's a great book. I read that one," and things like that. I hadn't even thought of that. Keith, I know that we had a wide variety of sound quality when we did our 40 interviews, and sometimes that comes down to the person's headphones or earbuds, or the speakers or microphone on their computer. I wonder if you can address the idea of sound. I mean, because it was very distracting when you had to really struggle to hear that person and get the gist of what they're saying. And some of them were really hard work, so we could even just to understand the person due to the quality of sound. Do you have any thoughts or input on that?
First of all, I would stress the importance of sound, good sound, because that's what the whole thing is about. It's about an interview and your answers to the questions that are being presented. So I think it's really important that the sound quality is as good as you can make it. Again, I'm not a techie, I'm not really technical, so I don't know if I have a lot of input as far as what to use over anything else. I just know one example. There was an interview where he was really struggling, and it almost sounded like he was in an echo chamber, or yeah, it was really hard to hear, really hard to pick out what he was saying in his interview. And we could ask him to say it again, but it wouldn't be any better the second time. So the one thing I noticed that was a little bit more common, somebody can correct me on this, but is that he was using just through the air. So maybe it was a webcam microphone or something, rather than headphones or earbuds. So that may have affected. Again, you can correct me if I'm wrong there. I don't know specifics, but maybe just considering where you are, so not an echoey room, and if you can, maybe using some sort of technology where you're directly hooked in, like earbuds or headphones.
Maybe we'll move on now to body language a little bit. Does anybody have anything they want to add on sound quality, echoes, technology of headphones, or anything else? Something that you think is really important that we may have missed?
Yeah, I'll just add one thing that I just am doing now. I actually never did it. I notice all of you are shutting your mics off when you're not speaking. So I think that could also help eliminate any kind of extra noise around you. So only maybe keep your microphone on if you have that option when you are actually speaking versus when you're not.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Rosemary. I have a small house with 6 people living in it, and there's going to be distractions. So I set up my camera so that hopefully people aren't walking in and out of the frame, but also I need to make sure I mute because chances are there's going to be some noise. I know, Emily, you were going to add something there.
Yeah, I was also just thinking about the echo. So if you aren't using headphones and a mic, sometimes the sound will come out of your computer and then bounce back through the mic. So the interviewers will wind up hearing their question as they're saying their question, which can make it quite distracting and hard to actually ask the question. So just thinking about the echo too of the space you're in, and if you're using or not using headphones or a mic, to think about how is that sound echoing if you don't have your mic muted when you're not speaking.
Well, for sure. And I think the whole idea of an interview is we're trying to give the best impression. And I know if I'm being interviewed and I'm annoying that person for the entire time, through no fault of my own perhaps, but if they're annoyed, it's not going to be a good impression. If they have to struggle to hear me, or if they just can't wait for this to end because it's so painful to look at or listen to, that's not going to be me putting my best foot forward and having the best chance at this job, for sure. I want to go on and talk a little bit about body language. The body language is very different. I noticed in our 40 interviews, some people were really warm and they were able to somehow break down that wall between us with this computer screen and this camera. And it was almost like you were there with them, you know, the eye contact and the smile, and it was really enjoyable. It wasn't annoying. And for that period of time, I was able to feel like I was in an interview with that person. So there are certain things we can do, I think, with our body language and things like that. But maybe we'll start with you, Rosemarie, and then we'll move on. But you always seem to have very good body language, and I noticed even today on this one, you know, you've thought about how you're sitting and how, you know, the percentage of screen you're filling and things like that. And do you want to maybe comment on body language on virtual interviews?
Yeah, for sure. So one of the things that I really struggle with virtual interviews is I don't feel like it's very personable because you can't make that eye contact with people personally. So I do find talking into the actual camera, making sure that your eyes are like looking at the camera, not looking at yourself on the screen or maybe someone else on the screen, especially if there's multiple people in the interview, it can be kind of distracting. And then I think just obviously having good posture is really important. Just as it is important in a normal interview as well. And just taking in those like nonverbal cues, if you could nod, smile, but just, of course, being aware that like everything that you would do in a normal interview body-wise is still applicable with a virtual interview as well.
Yeah, that's great. I know, Keith, you don't talk with your hands at all, but I know Rosemarie does, and I talk with my hands, and Emily does a little bit. I know that some people have given us advice, like your face should be, you know, a certain percentage of the screen or something like that. But I sometimes find myself, because I'm fairly close, that I'm trying to talk to somebody on there and I'm going like this with my hands so they can see. If I want to use a bit of body language and talk with my hands a bit, does anybody have any ideas on how I can do that, and how much of my face should be on that screen? And what happens when I start leaning in like this and kind of freak the person out and pull back and everything else? Is that distracting in an interview? Like Emily, you maintain you don't move. You sit in the middle and you maintain your position on the camera. Keith, you're the same way. You don't go in and out and in and out. And I'm a fidgeter, so I'm going in and out and in and out. And so tips on how to minimize that fidgeting and make sure we present a good visage on the screen, but also if we want to use a bit of body language like hands and smiles and eye contact.
So one issue that I encounter, so I am a hands talker. So my upper body might be, you know, in one position and have good posture. But one issue that I've encountered in video interviews is that because I use my hands, sometimes the positioning of my screen makes it so that you only see like this happening and you don't see the full hand movement actually happening. So it's something that I've had to learn to be really cognizant of. So now I do try to keep my hands a little bit lower when I'm in a video interview, so that I'm only really using them for emphasis. I think if you are a hands talker, it's great. It helps you to be understood, and it can be a really good way to demonstrate a point. And I think with video interviews, it's just, again, thinking about, you know, what's the actual, I can't think of the term, but, you know, what's the capture width of the screen, and what's actually going to be captured when I'm using my hands. So where am I placing my camera to account for that, and to make sure that if I am using my hands, that it's an effective use of them. So you're not just seeing like some fingers crawling up on the side, but you're seeing, maybe I'm saying like on one hand, on the other hand, and making sure that it's actually captured by that camera.
Thanks, Emily. Keith, you want to add something on that?
I think Emily's right that you have to be aware of it and to reduce it as much as you can. But I don't think you have to go too overboard with it, because I think moving in and out a little bit and moving it gives a more natural appearance when you're talking as well. So I wouldn't go overboard with it, I guess is my point.
Yeah, just to jump on that, one thing that I really like to do as an interviewer, is to nod, because like when I'm talking, I don't see myself on the screen. So an interviewee is going to be seeing, whoever was talking last. And so just to make people more comfortable, I do a lot of nodding, which I think is an important thing to think about too. And like Keith said, you don't want to just be sitting like a statue.
Do you guys find yourselves when you're interacting on this platform nodding more? Because when we were doing those 40 interviews, I really felt like I want to show this person that I'm there with them, and I know they're nervous, and so just through empathy, I found myself nodding because I knew they couldn't hear me, but then I know they can't necessarily see a nod very well on a sidebar, so I was doing these big nods all the time, but trying to give some feedback to them was a challenge, but I really felt like I wanted to give them feedback. Did anybody else feel that way?
Absolutely. And I think video interviews do take away a bit of that personal interaction, where, the space for interviews or conversation becomes more difficult because you don't have the body language of the interviewer to go off of. So I did find myself nodding quite a lot to the interviewees, smiling a lot. Keith and Tyree, you probably noticed, but I would repeat my questions often or rephrase them, and do check-ins to make sure the interviewee actually understood the question, in case there was like a lag issue or, anything of the sort. So I did find myself kind of overcompensating and nodding more than I usually would.
I definitely did. I nodded all the time. I felt like I was going to have a sore neck by the end of the day sometimes. But Keith, you wanted to address the idea of lag time. Now, sometimes we don't even know, like some person on the call might have a lag and the other side doesn't. And we're not always sure if there is a lag time. And I don't know if we should say, be addressing it and asking the person on the other side, is there a lag time? Or is there a certain way just to communicate to make sure we allow for that lag? From our experience interviewing those people for that CPE position, how would you address the idea of lag time?
Just from the interviews, it's I don't know. I always seem to know if there is a lag time, so I think you can kind of get an idea if there is, just on your own, and just to be aware of it. I think it's an issue with everybody, so it's just important to know that it's happening, and just to maybe take a pause before you start speaking again, just so you're not interrupting the interviewer at all. Just I think that pause is important, just because it can, as an interviewee, it can throw you off quite a bit if you're all of a sudden interrupting the interviewer, which obviously may not leave a good impression. Again, no fault of your own, maybe you didn't realize, but just having that pause in between when you're speaking, and then letting the interviewer respond and maybe ask that next question.
For sure. Anybody else want to add anything about lag time? Or I know sometimes there's the audio lag, but there's sometimes a visual lag as well, and that can be I find it really annoying, and that's why I have avoided doing virtual meetings for so long, because I can't stand visual lag. It really bothers me, but I guess we've just kind of had to come to grow to love it lately, because it certainly happens. Anybody have any experience with some interviews where the visual video was really out of sync with the audio?
I was going to speak more generally, but I was just going to say, when I'm working with my clients now, if we are doing something virtually, I do take time when I'm with my clients to say, this is a virtual setting, and obviously, like, there's a lot more people on these virtual platforms, which make it more likely to have lag. So we can always repeat, we can go back. You just have to ask questions. And I find it just about creating that space where you can say, these are the needs that I have, and these are the things that I've missed. And I need to go back to this area. So I think in an interview, as an interviewee, I would approach it with the same kind of mentality and say, I recognize that we're on a virtual platform, so please let me know if you need me to repeat an answer. I'm more than happy to type out anything if there is some sort of visual or audio lag, or I'm happy to turn my camera off for a while to see if that improves the bandwidth, whatever it might be. But I think as an interviewee, it's important to kind of be proactive and take that step to say to the interviewer, I'm willing to adapt to what's going to work best to avoid those technical issues.
How does this person handle different situations? How do they handle setting up for a virtual interview? How on top of their own technology, whatever it might be, how on top of that are they, and how ready are they for me? Are they on time for this meeting? And all these things form a picture for that interviewer. And as they look into their crystal ball and decide and try to look at that person doing the job that they expect them to do in the future, or hope that they can do in the future, how full of a picture are we painting? And I think every little thing we do in these interviews helps contribute to that picture. And so the idea of professionalism in these interviews is really important, even though it's, sometimes there might be a cat running across the room in the background and whatever else. There's things we can do to help paint that full picture. Rosemary, I know you maybe, I don't know if we've covered things that you wanted to speak about professionalism, but could you talk just briefly about the idea of that professional picture you can paint even through a virtual interview?
So I think the one thing that you should focus on is you should focus on the stuff that you can control. So maybe you can't control how well your Wi-Fi is going to be, but you can control maybe eliminating certain distractions like your phone. If you have a home phone in your house, maybe unplugging it. Maybe don't start your washer and dryer if it makes lots of noise, and maybe try to eliminate or remove certain siblings or people or animals if you can. So try to prevent any of those factors. And I think it just goes with what Emily said, creating an environment of just being a little welcoming and understanding, and just apologizing if there was some kind of distraction that did happen or occur. And then I think just also making sure that you start on a positive note and then you end on a positive note as well. So just having a strong beginning and also a strong ending as well. So like you would do in a normal interview, introduce yourself, even though you might not be shaking hands, you're still wanting to make that positive first impression. And then also having a strong ending as well, thanking them for your time and for listening in on this virtual interview, despite any kind of disruptions that might have occurred.
Like, virtual interviews are a great chance to show your flexibility and to kind of demonstrate some of those softer skills in more subtle ways. So, you're able to showcase that you are flexible and adaptable, and that you're kind of willing to meet the employer where they're at, which is sometimes hard to do in an interview. So there are some advantages.
We're basing what we're talking about on our own experiences conducting interviews and consultations with clients on a virtual platform. I think this is a platform we're going to have to get more and more used to, especially when we consider the idea of maybe flying all over the place for a job interview. Even environmentally isn't perhaps the best approach, and when it can be done effectively on a virtual platform. And as we get used to these virtual platforms, people will get better and better at using them. And I think where we are today, it's a good start, and we've been sort of pushed into adopting this technology, and so we might as well get comfortable with it and get better at using it. Thank you to Keith, Em, and Rosemary for joining me today.